How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Oliver Gonzalez here. And well, today let's going to look at this Model 1, especially at CSS for JavaScript developers, which is a course taught by Josh Komewa as a way to make sense and to finally understand now what is the role of CSS. And anytime that we need to write or read code on it, we know what this thing is doing because we know is the fundamentals. And despite that you might have AI that can help you to do stuff, if you don't know what you're doing, the AI will trap you to a sea of hallucination. And you have to be careful with that because what you're gonna do is to spend a lot of time unnecessary. This is the reason why true is efficient. True is something that save you time. So in any case, here we are, right? So rendering logic, which is part of this 11 models that here we are from CSS, from JavaScript developers. This is a course from Josh Camilla, a software engineer that has previously worked at several companies. One of them is Khan Academy, and the other is Gatsby, where what we're doing is just to take notes out of this. All right. Here we just go for the model 1. Right. In this 2 model, we briefly describe is what the CSS is and the fundamentals of CSS. I won't dive deep into this. Just to briefly mention is these topics. So for example, is that what is CSS? What is a CSS rule? What is the anatomy of CSS? So how you can add styles, how you can now select elements, also how you can use these selectors to select elements. So what are the specific functions that the language provide you to, and the behaviors that the language, like add rules, give it to you in order to do something. So for example, import a CSS file or define a set of CSS rules using the add layer, or the transitions, or the keyframes for animations. Another anatomy is the shorthands property, and last but not least is the comment. And the things that are still relevant in 2025 is that you need to know what media query is, why this is useful and helpful. Also is the most common element selectors, whether it is class based or pseudo elements like hover, focus, first and last, end, child, or type. And why we look at focus, because this is something that as you develop UI, you must define those interface for a wide audience out there. So not only for people that can use their 5 cents, but also for people that require its assistant technologies. All right, which is the reason why we need to understand is the WIRA, right? This web content accessibility guidelines, the WebCGA, right? And the principles that when you are define this user interface, you must follow to make it more inclusive. So those principles are that, hey, what you're building is perceivable, is this operable, is this robust, and this is understandable, okay? uh, and also is, well, the color, what is the color and the different color that we can use, the different color formats, the different unit or the most common unit that we can go with, whether it's pixels, root n and m, and percentage, and why we use percentage for specific uh, properties in CSS. For example, like width calculation or the aspect ratio, which is something that we're going to explore in today's video, right? The width algorithm and the height algorithm. In the typography, which is how you going to use and include is different set of uh, font families. What is a font family, and why we have is these web fonts. What is the anatomy of this typography, whether it's by sans or sans serif, and the variants that we can have in this font family, whether it is by weight or variants like bold or italic, and when you can use each one of them, all right? As well as how can we now understand is the position of the text, the transformation in the space, the letter spacings or the line height. All of it is just the fundamentals that we need to understand in order to move on to what's coming next, which is understanding now how CSS works behind the scenes. So because CSS is this language that describe is how this document will represent across different medias, visual media, whether it is screens or print or speech synthesizers, among other stuff, which to me was quite interesting that CSS actually is defining here as a way to now represent is all of these different medias. But particularly what is relevant in this video is the screen media. So because traditionally this type of let me make a quick pause here. All right, and we're back. So because now, in order to understand is the rendering logic, first we saw that all of these browsers that they have their own rendering logic, because this is the way how these elements we're gonna look like, HTML elements and DOM elements, and they have now these built-in style sheets known as the user agent style sheet, because back in the old days there were several of this so there were no consistent way to define how these elements were gonna look like. So because of that, each browser implements their own set of rules, and designers now create a CSS reset to say, hey, this is not the blank state where we're going to now build all of our elements and the style on top of that. So I do find that that's quite interesting because knowing this, which is something that now giving at the current state of the CSS, most browsers actually stick to the spec, which is a great stuff, but some of them might not adhere completely to some layout behaviors. So for example, and how all of these elements should look like. So because in CSS you can now is inherit properties, especially text-based property, right? So for example, like color is one of them, and the way how now this different CSS rules are using is the cascade algorithm, which is made of several tiers. So the tier 1 you have is those that are important, whether it is transition, important, animations, and normal, okay? And the other is the way of or where these style sheets are defined, whether it's on the browser, whether it's on the uh, web app or user, and yeah, web app users, or the browser. And then the last tier is the one of before the last tier, you have now is the specificity of the selector, and last but not least is the order in which these particular rules are defined. So the further it falls into the cascade, the less likely is for that style to be applied. So this is important because as we're going to define is the direction of our content, because this was developed by most of these concepts from CSS come from the print industry, which was developed circa in 13th centuries, 14th centuries, in the Gutenberg print, right? Those were now for Western cultures, okay? So it means that all of this different stuff, or the way of how can we read the content, right, is in this Western format, right, from left to right and top to down. Because now we have to provide is content to different cultures, whether it's the Western culture or the Middle East, or the hand-based character, for example, in Asian character sets. So South Korea, Japan, Laos, North Korea, you like it or not, China, Philippines, and all the others. Sorry if I don't recall all of them, but I do find that this way of presenting the content, because now the web has, especially browser, has putting a test, so has a stretch the capability of what it can offer. So now we can is define is the direction of the content. So traditionally, to indicate both, you say, hey, this is an inline, this is how the content is being read, okay, whether it's left to right or right to left, okay, or top to down in the case of hand-based character, the Asian way of reading content, and the block, which is perpendicular to how the text is read, which made of this block of paragraph. So now the sales pitch of this direction is the internationalization. This is why we're going to see from this moment on is logical operators when it comes to work with the boxes. Boxes, which is the way of how now CSS, especially when it comes to representing is a document in screens, it is the box model, right? And this is made up of several layers around the content. This is what we have now: padding, the border, and the margin, right? Where now the padding, we look at how can we work with that, the different shortcuts and the logical properties for internationalization as well. And also is the border, on how you can now is not only define is the border of this box, sorry, yeah, the border of this box, but by default it requires is the style, so to show something, okay. And how can we now define its borders of this border, and something that even the spec they say, hey, you know what, yes, there are a couple stuff that we regret, and one of them is call the border not as corner radius in any case. But unlike the outline, which is another property, outline is not part of the computation in the CSS box model, right? But it's used, for example, is to highlight is content like inputs for screen readers or any other assistant technologies. And then we have now margins. So with margins, because the way how the content was created was just to follow is this direction that I mentioned before. So hey, we have now the inline, and then we have now the blocks that is gonna be a one after the another. So because with margin we also have things known as negative margins, where now the content can overlap on that, which is the reason why we are looking at this. Tiki, where it is, right? Like negative margins, okay? So now this particularly content that can now overlaps here, and also how can we use now auto for align the margins here, okay? And some couple exercise when it comes to now work with margins. And because the box is the representation of how this document is going to be present on the screen, so this layout, which is this set of possible organizations that our boxes can be, okay, the default one is the flow layout. So if you don't modify any of the display property, so by default it has now this flow layout. So this flow layout is calculated by the layout algorithm that determines the position and the geometry of that particular element. All right. So because this flow layout, okay, is made of which is one of the several layouts that we can have in this box. We can have its position or flexible box or grid. Here now on this flex layout, or particularly the normal flow layout, is made of two particularly components. So whether it's a block or an inline. So inline elements, they don't make a fuss. They take all the available space horizontally, all right? You can is move that box on the horizontal axis using margin, all right? But you can is modify its dimension. Particularly is the width or the height. That doesn't work. And another feature is you can now with inline break the content of this. So this is the inline and its property, and the other is the border, where the border is takes all the horizontal space available, right? It doesn't care about line break, okay? And here, unlike inline elements, we can modify is the dimension of this element, right? And there is another property which is the inline block. You can think of this like the wolf in a lamb's clothing, wolf in a sheep clothing, which is the blocks in an inline clothing, right? So inline block allows you to modify its dimension, all right, but it doesn't. It behaves not like an inline element, okay, but it doesn't line break. And understand, for example, is this particularly type of elements that we can have in this layout using is the box model. So there are group of elements that are fall into the block category, to this bucket, and the others are the inline. And also on the inline, so image, videos, and canvas, when you use the normal flow, they are technically are inline elements, and there are some particularly quirky behaviors. One of them is when you use now image and you separate each one of them, the browser detect that as in space amounts them, and this is something that you don't want to apply. Definitely, this is something that you don't definitely want to do that. So to fix that, you just only put all of these different image next to each other, so you don't add any white space to that. And the other is the line height, because all of these inline elements and are treated like typography. So what it does is to, in the case of image, adding this little extra height, that we can fix that by just adding the line height or line height 0. So this is just to describe is one particularly layout mode that we can have in the box model. Okay, and when it comes to this layout, compute the width and the height. Okay, we look at the width and height algorithm. Okay, that say, hey, the when you're using now units like percentage, it's gonna use that. So the value of this width will be is whatever is on the parent. However, if you're using is now, for example, is min content, max content, or fit content, their width will be is the children. It will be dictated by it is children. Now, so in the case of max content, is quite straightforward. All right, you're gonna take all the available space in there. The min content say, hey, what is the widest elements? What is the widest children element? And that will be is my element, the width of this element. And the other is the fit content, right? So we also look at particularly the thought experiment here, which I do find quite revealing and quite mind-bending. Yep, in order to understand that a little bit. So how you can now try to is make this as like this, short and mid-length. You know how you can make or try to make that as it is. And the other is that how you can now is, for example, add some wrappers to the and try to horizontally align this. So how you can now add some margin here, and then you horizontally align that, right? So this is funny, interesting exercise that are still relevant, especially if you are a front-end UI engineering. And the other is the height, because with height, the algorithm here, exactly. And here, there you go. Height algorithm. So we have seen how width are calculated in flow layout, but how about height? Exactly. So in some way it works the same way. So since if you set height with percentage, it's gonna take is the height or the value of its parents and apply that percentage to that, right? So this is the default behavior as it is. And also we tend to treat the height as more dynamic than width. We might feel comfortable setting our main content wrapper to have a max width of 700, but we generally want to avoid setting fixed heights. Otherwise, we might wind up in situations like this. So when it comes to layout wrapper like this, setting a fixed height is usually a bad idea. But what about when we want to set a minimum height? For example, let's say that we have an element that wraps around our entire app. Mm-hmm. Let's say we have an element that wraps around our entire app. If a specific page doesn't have much content, the entire app might be less than 100% of our window height. What if we want to take up at least 100% of the available space? Okay, which is here. If I want to take all the available space, our goal is to have a wrapper element that will be no smaller than 100% of the available heights. So min height here doesn't work. So this is if you want to now work with the height here, and why most of the time we prefer to dynamically so to be let be that dynamically calculated, right? But what happens when you do need to actually is, for example, take all the available space. So we want is to fill the available space, because unlike width, all right, where it is values calculated is based on its children, it goes down the tree, all right. Height is going to be calculated is on the way up here. So by default, width looks up. So by default, width looks up the tree when it comes to compute that. Okay, to compute is that value, and while height looks down the tree, an element width it is calculated based on its parent size, but an element's height is calculated based on its children. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to height, a parent element will shrink wrap itself around its children, like a pouch of vacuum sealed food. We can override this behavior by specifying an explicit value. For example, is width 300 and height 500, and don't look up or down the tree. They don't have to calculate anything since they are giving in a specific value. So I'm specifically talking about when don't okay, and specifically about when we don't set the width and the height. So when you don't have you ever tried to use percentage based heights only to discover that it seems to have no effect? And it is because what is this doing? So our sections sit inside the body tags, and so when we set a percentage based height or mean height, the percentage is based on the parent heights. Body doesn't have a specific height set, which means it uses a default behavior. Stay as short as possible while still containing all the children's. In other words, we have an impossible condition here. But again, as we saw earlier, the default behavior of an element in terms of its height is to be as small as possible. So how do we know that this is true? Well, if you, for example, now take a look at this paragraph, right? For example, this is now a text node and an element here. So the height of the element is calculated based on the smallest, and as you can see, is adding an extra text here. It's adding an extra line here. So if you say now line height 0, okay. Okay. That's quite interesting. Good. All right. All right. So the height by default is calculated by the smallest, to be small as possible to contain its children. Interesting. Interesting. So by default, exactly. So by default is that. So by default is that. Interesting. So by default, the element height is to be as small as possible. The height algorithm. So if you want to now compute is the height of an element, especially if you want to take all the available height on the viewport, you need to specify that at the root elements to say, hey, the height of this will be now, for example, the entire height, right? And then they can now take up into that. There, of course, are now other particular units. What about the V height unit? You may be familiar with VH unit, a unit designed exactly for this purpose. If you set 100%, if you say height to 100 V height, which is the viewport height, your elements will inherit its height from the viewport size. Unfortunately, this unit doesn't quite work the way often like because of mobile devices. So when you scroll on a mobile device, the address bar and footer controls slide away, yielding their space to the content. This means that scrolling on a mobile device changes the viewport height. To avoid flickering UI issues, browsers like iOS Safari and Chrome Android will set the V height equals to the maximum viewport height after scrolling. This means that when the page first loads, 100 VH will actually be quite a bit taller than the viewable areas. So to avoid flickering UI users, browsers like iOS Safari and Chrome Android will set the view height equal to the maximum viewport height after scrolling. This means that when the page first loads, 100 V height will actually be quite a bit taller than viewable areas. If you want to see this for yourself, here's some demos here. Give a shot on your phone. Holy moly. In full height percentage. But this is in browsers like iOS Safari or in Chrome Android. But it's because of this. So when you scroll on a mobile device, the address bar and footer controls slide away, yielding their space to the content. So this means that scrolling on a mobile device changes the viewport height. So if you're now on here, on an iPhone, for example, and if you reload that, these days there are new units we can use that don't share this problem. In particular, the SVH unit, small viewport height, will always correspond to shorter viewport size. A shorter viewport size, the initial condensed viewports. In case where you want an element's height to be equal to the viewport, my recommendation is to do this. Fallback for older browsers, and this is if you want to get is the viewport height. This unit is available across all major modern browsers, but it's still good to provide a fallback for older browsers. It is still worth knowing how percentage-based height work, since there will be case when you want to use a parent container's size rather than the viewport. But hopefully this new small viewport height unit comes in handy. But what about the footer? Earlier we talked about the common UI challenge of having a footer that stayed at the bottom. Having a full container that stayed at the bottom. Having a full container is an important prerequisite, but we haven't seen the tools needed to finish solving this problem. Ultimately, the goal with this model is to get comfortable with the height algorithm in flow layout, to understand why height and mean height sometimes don't do what we expect. Specifically, in order to solve this problem, we need to use Flexbox. So Flexbox is the subject of the oncoming model, and we'll see how to solve this and many other problems with it. I know cliffhangers aren't any funny. Cliffhangers. 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 What in the F is this? Cliffhangers. Cliffhangers. How do you translate it into Spanish? Cliffhanger. Cliffhangers. Okay. Cliffhangers. Okay, cliffhangers. Okay. No estuvo en ascuas. No estuvo al borde del abismo, así. Ok. Al borde del abismo. Cliffhangers. Cliffhangers. Okay. No, don't come with your cliffhangers, bro. No. Cliffhangers, man. Okay. Okay. No. Please. Okay, cliffhangers. So in order to solve this, if it doesn't make sense you to get it, don't worry. But before too long, you'll become a Flexbox champion. But exactly, it's because it's adding now a flex. It's say, hey, here this wrapper, all of these particular elements, it'll be now a column, flex direction a column, which is by default it is. There is no need to do this, right? But it seems like you have to specify that. So you say, hey, the wrapper will be now flexible box, and now the mean height of this will be the 100%, which is something that we inherit from our parent. Okay, so the first element of the top will be this, and the second element will be now is this footer. This is quite interesting. So if I add another element and another element and so on and so forth, it's gonna do that. Flex direction column. So what you can do here is to say, hey, let's make this to be a display block. Oh, of course. It's because we are now centering in this element. So by default it's now stacking into rows. Okay, it's stacking into a row, but if you say, hey, let's make this column, it makes a lot of sense. Make this as a column here. Alright. It is also possible to solve this problem with absolute position, something we'll see in Model 2, and I do not recommend this approach, though the footer can overlap other content unless you're very careful and use hacky workarounds. So this is just to describe is the flow layout, right? The width and the height, and how now width is something that is, and how the width algorithm is computed in the flow layout, as well as the height is computed on the height layout. Okay, so the width by default looks up the tree, and the height by default looks down the tree. In order to calculate that, in order to calculate that, so for example, here in this case, if I inspect this and like this, right? If I inspect this and say, hey, what'll be is the footer? So by default, the height in the flow layer, okay, the width in the flow layer, it is look up in the patterns. So it's calculated is by looking up the tree. Whereas the height by default, it is look down the tree. In order to know is what is that? Is look down the tree. To calculate is the height of this. If I say line height 0 is this. Unless you say auto, and then it's now computing from that. Then we look now at the margin collapse. So margin collapse. Earlier we talked about how margin is akin to its personal space, and let's suppose that we want to keep 6 feet of personal space. When you think about it, though, that 6 feet can be shared, right? If each person has a 6-foot bubble, we don't actually need to be 12 feet away. The margins are overlapping, but that's okay. Still respecting the margin. Too close, margin not respected. So margins work in similar fashion. Adjacent margins will sometimes collapse and overlaps, and this can lead to some surprising behaviors.
So margin has this tricky thing that we need to talk about, which is, unlike padding and border, it is possible for margins to overlap. Say you have 2 paragraphs, right, one on top of the other, and each of those paragraphs wants to have 20 pixels of margin, 20 pixels of space. If you just put them one on top of the other, you're not going to get 40 pixels between them, you're going to get 20 because the 2 paragraphs are going to share that margin space. And this is called margin collapsing. It's the idea that when you have margins that are side by side, they collapse into one space. And this sounds simple, but there's lots of little conditions and edge cases that make it actually really hard to develop an intuition for if you just wing it. Taking a little bit of time to familiarize yourself with these rules makes things so much easier and so much more intuitive. And so that's what this lesson is about. We're going to develop an intuition for how margins collapse when they do and don't. And just to give you a quick idea as to how this can be surprising and how unintuitive it can be, I want to look at an example. So here I have, it's just a heading and some text sitting in a white box. And you'll notice this heading is right at the top of the box, right? It doesn't have any breathing room. So you might think one way to solve for this is to give this heading a bit of top margin. So I'm selecting just the heading, right? Not the container, but the heading. And I'm going to say margin top. And let's give it 24 pixels. And what you'll notice is it's not moving the heading down, it's moving the entire container. If I look at the container in the DevTools, right, it still doesn't have any top margin. If I scroll all the way down here, there's no top margin. So it is the margin of this heading which is pushing the whole thing down. And this is weird. We can make this even more noticeable if I increase the size of that margin. Let's bring it up by an order of magnitude. And now you'll see that all of this space isn't getting between the element and its environment. It's transferring up to the parent. This probably doesn't even seem like margin collapse, but it is, and we're going to talk about why that is.
Margin collapse. So is the idea of that now two elements, so is the idea that elements, exactly, is the idea that two elements are now collapsing their margins. And the rules. To really understand margin collapse, we need to consider a lot of different circumstances. And this can be a lot to take in. The very next lesson is a game testing on this concept. You may wish to bounce between the two, go over a couple rules by trying the game, rinse and repeat. But it's just an algorithm. If you don't understand the algorithm, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just a series of steps that we as men and women define. As humans, we define this, right? Only vertical margin collapse. Here's a canonical margin collapse example. Multiple paragraphs in a row. Like this. Only vertical margin collapse. Only vertical margin collapse. So if you now put this in writing most, only vertical or particularly is block collapse. Block's direction collapse. Yeah. So for example, like this, writing mode, vertical, left and right. Margin only collapse in flow layout. Okay. The bigger margins wins. The bigger margin wins. Nesting doesn't prevent collapsing. So block by padding or border, block by a gap, block by a scroll container, margin can collapse in the same direction. Child and the parent. But the greater will triumph. More than two margins can collapse. So here you say, hey, this header, which now have a margin of bottom 10, and margin header 1 of my project will have is the margin bottom 20. Okay. More than two margin can collapse. So more than two margin can collapse. And the bigger one will triumph, which is 40 pixels. Exactly. which is 20. This is 10. This has now 30 margin top, and this has now 40. So the bigger one will triumph. More than 2 margins can collapse, and the other is negative margins. How do negative margin collapse? Well, it's actually quite similar to positive one. The negative margin will share a space, and the size of that space is determined by the most significant negative margin. In this example, the example overlaps by 75 pixels, since the most negative margin minus 75 pixels was more significant than the another. What about when negative and positive margins are mixes? In this case, the numbers are added together. In this example, so with no margins, and with margins. Multiple positive and negative margins. No 3D illustration for this one. Honestly, I was too busy and chaotic looking to offer much clarity. You can probably understand now why margin collapse has such a dastardly reputation. This reputation. Dick Dastardly. Oh. Dick Dastardly. Ah, it's okay. Dastardly. Okay. Wacky races. Wacky, bro. I love that. I love that word, bro. Wacky. It's so silly, that word, bro. Wacky. In Spanish, it is Los Autos Locos. Wacky races. Interesting. Peter Woodhart. Billy West. Nicole Parker. Billy West. Okay. Oh, Bugs Bunny. Interesting. Holy hell. Billy West. What? 30 years of voiceover. On Apple Music. Bill West. Podcast. Okay. Joe's apartment. Oh my god. Holy moly, bro. Okay. So they use the Richard Nixon voice. Right. Holy moly, bro. Okay.
Welcome to your new home. Our new home.
Oh, we're back, baby.
In 2 seconds, you will collide with your destination.
Good news, everyone. We seem to have survived a massive disruption in the flow of time.
Wait, what exactly happened?
Here, look at this. Stop fighting! Okay, I'm done. To the ship!
A new virus has broken out.
I've developed a test to see who's infected. You jam this Q-tip up your nose. That looks kind of fun. I can't wait to do it hundreds of times.
Pretty lawless out here in crypto country. Say, you interested in a job? Alright, why don't you have a belt?
Or at least a substantial butt! Sorry, guys. I'm a flatty. Men gave me gift. That's an order. Ow! You do you, weirdo! Bite my glittering vested ass! Yep.
How do we get out of here?
Easy, we'll burrow out. Burrow! Burrow! I deserve that!
I'm just glad you're back.
Would you like to order erotic scented massage oil or fuzzy handcuffs?
Yes, please. That's creepy.
I mean, yeah, so creepy.
Okay, so he was one of the voice of that. Interesting. Okay, so we are here because we were actually is the wacky races and all that kind of stuff. Nice. Dig Dastardly and Thurman. Okay. Billy West, similar for Nicole Parker. Meet the Spartan. Oh, I get it. Disaster movie. And that kind of stuff. And let's be real. Wacky races. Oh, I get it. Titanic Key. Oh no, this is a okay. Titanic Key. The Little Mermaid. Ursula. Playbill. And La Coche aux Folles. Okay. Okay. Billy West podcast. And Titanic Key. What the French toast is this? Oh, it's like a okay. A musical. No, that's not for me. Definitely, that's not for me. But I do find wacky, dastardly. Has such a dastardly reputation. This stuff is tricky, and that's no joke. As mentioned, the next lesson features a game that will let you test your collapsed knowledge. Don't be afraid to pop back to this lesson for a refresher after you play. It might take a few tries before everything clicks. So will it collapse? So instead of saying will it blend, will it collapse? The rules of margin collapse can be confusing, especially when considering how they interact to each other. Rather than trying to memorize all, better a way to develop an intuition about it to experiment and test your knowledge. And let's get some practice here. So adjust the position of the box element. Okay. Adjust the position of the box element. That's interesting. So you say, hey, margin top is this. So you're adding now a margin to that. This is very interesting here. The other is adjust the position of both, but they can overlap? No, they cannot overlap? Okay. Adjust the position of both elements. Margin top, 40 pixels. Margin top, margin bottom 40 pixels, and margin bottom 40, because both of them have the same margin, so they collapse here, and it is 40. So they don't add that, they collapse. Margin collapse. adjust the position of the second box. So you have now inline block and inline block, and because they now here you can affect is the horizontal stuff. It only affects on the block. It only affects on the block. So margins only collapse. Horizontal margins don't collapse in left to rights. Okay, horizontal margin, they don't collapse. Horizontal margin, they don't collapse here. Adjust Canada position. Alaska margin bottom 40 and Canada margin bottom 20. When margins collapse, okay, when margins collapse, the largest win. Interesting. Adjust an element as needed. Margin padding top of the box is 20 and item margin top is 40. Okay, our inner box is pushed down to the tweak the element below as needed. Parent is margin top 40 and child is margin top 40. Again, all of this is on the flow layout. So my intuition say that this will happen, right? But our child and above parent have 40 margin top and the space collapse. Surprisingly, this means that our child sits right at the top of the parent containers, since its margin was fall into the parent here. Tweak the elements below as needed. You have the padding, no relevant style, and the chart and the margin top. Both of them are going to push that. This case can be surprising. You might expect childs to get pushed down within a parent, but it's actually the same situation as the last round. The child 40% is collapsing into the parent 0%. If you want to increase the spacing inside of an element, padding is a better choice. And the other is this: adjust inner and subsequent. Box inner and subsequent. So box is now padding top. The inner is margin bottom 40. But the inner, it's a margin bottom 40. And subsequent is margin top 40. So a wrapping element box doesn't necessarily affect margin collapse. It's only work if there is nothing in the way, like other elements, padding or border. Tweak all element as needed. Container margin top, you say is this. The container margin top is this, 20 pixels. The navigation is margin bottom, alright, of 20 pixels. Yeah, the navigation is margin bottom of 20 pixels, and the heading is 60. So, and the other in the heading is 16, a margin top like this. our container shift down. So our container shift down because of its margin top. Exactly. Our container shift down of its margin top. And the two children stayed at 60 pixels since their margins collapse. And tweak element as needed. The .NET, butterfly, and birth. It's a .NET is now padding top. Padding top. So it's adding padding top. Butterfly, it says margin top. And birth is margin bottom 40. Normally the margins of our birth and butterfly birth is margin bottom 40 and butterfly is margin top 20. Tweak element as needed. Border one solid. Margin top. This is the header. Margin top 20 and margin bottom 20. And the title inside of that has this margin top, so they don't add margin, so they collapse here. And then you have now the main to say margin top 20 pixels, so they don't add that content here, so they collapse here, so they collapse, right? No. Okay. Tweak elements as needed. Paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 have now margins on top and down, top and down. All right. Exactly, top and down. Exactly. Putting an H star between two paragraph breaks margin collapse. The HR block represent horizontal. Okay, they break is the margin collapse. Is there any elements there? Adjust the P element. So H say margin bottom 60. Margin bottom 60, and then P say margin top, margin bottom 60. Of course, exactly, are added together. Tweak element as needed. Header H1 sections paragraph. Tweak elements as needed. Margin bottom 20. Margin bottom 20 pixels. Heading. Margin bottom 20 pixels. Okay. H1 margin bottom is minus 40. Which means like it's going to collapse. Okay. And then the section say margin top of 80, which is 40. The greater margin will triumph. So this is like adding, and the greater margin will win. And the paragraph is margin top. Using margin effectively. Margin is like a glue. Using margin effectively. Now that you have seen how hairy margin collapse can get, you may wonder why use margin at all if it has so many foot guns. In fact, growing trend among JavaScript developers it is to forego margin altogether and use a combination of padding and layout component instead. Max Stoiber, co-creator of Style Component, has written about how margin is harmful. Margin considered harmful. The problem with using margin in a component: margin breaks component encapsulation. Margin makes component less reusable. Margin conflict with how designer thinks. User space instead. Instead of margin, I have started using spacers. Either component or class name, which move the responsibility of managing space to the parent level. For example, the Braid design system popularized the idea of a stack component. Of a stack component. Seek jobs. What is this? Design workflow. How do I leverage Braid in my design process? Playroom. And how they gonna look like? Okay. And how you can compose all of his components here. And how you can compose all of his components here. That's interesting. But what is relevant for that in my case? The co-creator of Style Component. Director of Engineering for Liquid Storefront at Shopify. Previously CEO and co-founder of Stella, acquired by Shopify. Co-creator and open source used by millions. Angel investor in 21 plus startup. Specialty coffee barista and backcountry skier. Backcountry skier. Backcountry skier. Oh, backcountry skier. Holy shit. That's interesting. Angel Invest. Together with Sue Audio, I Angel Invest small checks in early startup we're excited about. Think of us as advisors with skin in the game. We love helping with tricks, ambitious problems, providing access to our network and audience, or even just lending an ear. What we invest. Fly.io, a developer-focused cloud for developing apps close to users. Series A, 70 million. Series C led to equal vendors. Incident.io, Raycast, DX, the developer experience, Clerk. Clerk, Upstash, Set. Remote First Capital, Magic Bell, Def Jobs, a job matching platform for developers. But this is what in Germany. Exactly. That's a nice haircut, bro. Exactly in Germany. Interesting. Outsmartly, Storytel AI, Campsite, Fig, Stackshare, Muse, Abbott, Alone, and Rome, and modern JavaScript tooling. What? Okay. Sunset. Similar, Sunset. Appbot. Author, Dermot Hetko. Author and AI specialist. Gambling. Gambling can be addictive. Please play responsibly. News. Stackshare and Fig acquired by AWS. Fig has been sunset, migrated to Amazon Q. Deck Fig users. Amazon Q for command line. It is free on the individual tier and is designed to be faster and more reliable than Fig. Amazon Q. What is Amazon Q? Amazon Q Developer is a generative artificial intelligence powered by conversational assistant. Effective September 1, 2024. Fig acquired by AWS. Campsite acquired by Notion. Storytel.ai, an AI tool to extract signal from noise. Have real conversation with your data. Understand what's actually going on. Is another AI wrapper. Outsmartly, a CDN for performantly personalized websites. And Amazon Q. Amazon Q is constantly updating its capabilities so your question get most contextually relevant and actionable answers. When using an ID, Amazon Q provides software developing assistant. Amazon Q can chat about code, and they develop Amazon Q. Okay, but this is the tool that they have run or they have bet. Run like the best in e-commerce. Proven track record for e-commerce customers. Okay. BlendJet, Aerobex, Zero, Fairware Greens, Drady. Set. Ah, I get it. Exactly. The set. Yeah, I have a hear about this. Introducing cloud code now in beta in set. World class developer use set. So debugger, agentic editing, edit prediction, remote developer, multi-buffer editing, interactive programming, terminal and test runner, Beam friendly. AI that works the way your code, agentics editing, growing extension and ecosystem. Build with ultimate care. Language server protocol, outline, text manipulation, remote development. Programming and the tool we use to do so we are changing. As a culmination of 15 years of work developing industry-leading tools for developers like Atom, Electron, and Three-Seater, set strives to be at the forefront of this transformation. We have confidence that the future of software development lies in fluent collaboration between humans and AI, crafted from ground up. Set is here to make this vision in reality. Cloud code now in set. Bring your own agent to set. Sequoia backs set visions for collaborating. Sequoia Capitals. Daily drive with set. And this is you want to clone the source. Welcome to Set, a high-performance multiplayer code editor from the creators of Atom and Three-Seater. Multiplayer code editor from the creator of Atom and Three-Seater. Set.dev. But why they say isn't that? Remote expand the video. Oh, this is if you want to connect to a remote project. An open folder. Set.dev site. Oh, but this is if you want to update your changes. Edit prediction, multi-buffer editing, native kit support, agentic editing, and debugger. In Mastodon. Bostock, creator of D3 and founder of Observable. Okay, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Holy moly. They got a lot of okay. Holy hell. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All of the upstash clerk. This is for the authentication here. Complete user management here. Next, advanced security, bot detection, passwords, magic link, email and season management. So now it's a particular product here. Storytel.ai. But that's interesting. What are the investment he have made, right? Mm-hmm. So far, I have invested in this Fly.io, a public cloud build for developers who ship. Server full JavaScript without the hassle of the serverless. Mm-hmm. Raycast. Ah. Okay. Raycast. Why do I'm quite familiar with Raycast? Build the perfect tool. But it include publish to store. Yeah, they already is a lot of the SVG, bro. Okay, they made this with a lot of SVG. Holy crap. And then now they pick that as it is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But Raycast, I do think that I have. So that. What is Rake? Your shortcut to everything, exactly. It's a powerful productivity tool, all with an accessible launcher, fast, ergonomic, and reliable. Um, yeah, but this is for shortcuts. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, I do think that I have Raycast. If I don't, no problem. Any case, um, yeah, specialty coffee, Australian living in San Francisco. You probably don't need GraphQL. Why I love Tailwinds? Margin considered me harmful. Why I write CSS in JavaScript? Test choice I regret at Spectrum. Shopify, Director of Engineering. Stella, Acquire. Stella Day. Secure scaling, optimize your GraphQL API at the edge. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And enterprise solutions. Yeah, I do think that they actually sell that to them. Stella has the best your API can do. Okay. Senior staff software engineering, GitHub, Spectrum, and ThinkMill. Open source developer. ThinkMill. Design, build, and ship. Mm-hmm. Tech Council in Australia. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Cool. Cool. So I personally really like this idea about that margin is can be harmful, especially if you're developing that. The benefit of spacers. Spacers force us to build more encapsulated and thus reliable, reusable components. Spacers bring us closer to how designer thinks. And bonus, spacers keep our spacing consistent. Spacer can restrict spacing value to step on the scale. Space x3, margin left. That way, all the spacing automatically aligns with the grid and is consistent. Use spacers, band margin. Market list, as well as my good friends in Ogno to paving the way of prompt me to think about this. Mm-hmm. Improving communication between designers and engineers. Component driven, Monolisa font, Reaction Conf, a Reason Conf, Reason ML, okay, Color Snapper, and React Vienna. Holy hell. Okay. That was quite interesting. Good, good. Okay, okay. So I personally really like this idea, but I also want to acknowledge that it is impossible for most folk unless you're starting a brand new project and the entire team is on board. You'll be stuck with margin. You will need to learn how to use it effectively because most of the front end work relies on it. Margin is like is like glue. I really like this quote of Hayden Pickering. Margin is like putting glue on something before you decide what to stick on it, or if you should be stuck to anything. Okay, I try to and I try and avoid putting margin on something at a component boundary. For example, let's say we have a video clip component. You might be even imagine embedding this video in a blog post, and you will know you will want some space around it. But applying margin in this way, it is gluing the component without knowing where you stick. You might be saying, but no, I know where I want to stick in the blog post. And that's fine for bespoke, one of the components, but video clip sounds generic and reusable. So for reusable components, we want them to be unopinionated as possible. Because next week you may want to create a video strip component that lines up several video clips without any gap, and now you have a problem because the same component needs different amount of margins in different situations. So what's the solution? Layout component. So we'll see more example of this later in this course, but the basic idea is that the components aren't allowed to have external margin that extend past of the edge of the border box. Instead, components are grouped using layer components like stack. Bright design system. Okay. Bright design system is to say, hey, your stack must not have any margins, external margins that extend past of the edge of the border box. Instead, components are grouping using layout components like stack. And you can see an example of this kind of component in the Bright design system. Define a vertical rhythm of its child elements interleaving a uniform amount of space between each element. An alternative box for custom layout. The spacing between children and can be adjusted using the space props, and responsive values are supported: mobile, tablet, Mi desktop, and Y. Horizontal alignment. Okay, it's like wrapping that into a box where you are not going to but it all boils down is into that. It's into understand CSS. Is to understand now CSS. And how we're going to apply now CSS to the to our React components. And then we are here, workshop, agency page. Okay, alright, time to build something. In this workshop, we'll build a landing page for a fictional consultancy about workshops. Because this is the first workshop in the course, let's talk about how they work. Workshops are real-world inspired problems. The project and its goal are described in depth in the projects.readme.md file. Though you'll be given the gist of the project here and on the course platform, workshops are intended to be challenging, especially when we get deeper into the course. You may not be able to complete the challenge, and that's okay. It is about the journey, not the destination. This is another bullshit, bro. It is about the destination, bro. It is about the Jesus. This is when people romanticize ideas. And I am not here to romanticize things that live in concepts, because the more you live in concept, the less you are in the reality. So it's a destination here. But in any case, if you get stuck on a problem, you can review it. It's not only is the destination, is to understand why you're gonna get in the first place there. If you get stuck on a problem, you can review early lessons in the model to look for hints. Feel free to Google things or ask ChatGPT to see if it has any idea. If you're still stuck after that, you can check out the solution video in the next lesson to see how I solve the problem. Once you finish within the workshop, you can submit the link to your solution. This is mainly to serve as an accountability tool. On occasion, I go through the submissions to see broadly where people are struggling, but I don't offer individual review. Okay. Also, it is worth noting that there are many valid solutions for the workshop. Your solution might look quite different than mine, but that doesn't mean that you did it wrong. Alright, let's get to the specific of this workshop. Your mission. In this workshop, you're asked to build a landing page for an agency. In this way, right? Wealth comes from operations. Huckleberry, an avant-garde agency focused on connecting passion with logistics. A better way to solve problems of tomorrow. Wealth comes from operations. No motor business can thrive without developing a specialization in operations. Huckleberry has helped dozens of companies, from Fortune 50 monolithic to fast-growing Bay Area startups, achieve their goals and meets their KPI by leveraging our extensive network of logistic experts. Huckleberry was established in 2003 to help ambitious business discover their true potential. If that resonates, let's chat. So here's what it looks like on a tablet and on a mobile. Okay. This mock is built entirely using flow layout. No flexbox, no grid, no absolute positioning. It heavily relies on padding, margin, and border. No media queries are required. That's interesting. That's interesting. So getting started. Works on Code Sandbox. Save to refresh. There is no hot reloading. This means you need to manually save that or download from GitHub. The README file is your home base. It includes a specific instruction to see how the process and the README. Accessing the design. And then submit your workshop. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. And the design here. So we already have all of the content here. And the goal is to now, using only the flow layouts, organize everything like this way. So remember, because at the end of the day, the CSS allows to describe is how the document represent in different medias. And this is not from me, bro. So visual formatting. Is this one. Is this. Because one of the most important features of a style sheets or CSS is that it specify how a document is presented on different medias, whether it's screen, print, speech synthesizers, with a brightly device, etc. Certainly here, for the screen media, the visual formatting describe how all of these documents in the tree generate 0 or more boxes according to the box model, and how these boxes are governed by the layout, which is our rules here. Layout, that is box dimension and type, position schemes, relation between elements in the document tree, and external information, viewport size, intrinsic dimension of image, etc. But again, it's because of this. So I prefer to start with this. So because our CSS will now describe how the document should be present, should be represented in different media, in our case the screen, like this. And screens use the visual formatting to describe how elements in the document, or how a document, how elements in the document can generate 0 or more boxes. Okay, so we have now this huge box. Okay, so we can define is all the different boxes here. So we have now, let's go to build this up in, okay. So here we have 3 different layouts. So we can start it from the mobile to desktop, all right, where here we're going to define is how it's going to look like. So yeah, so now here is one box. So you have now the main content box, and the in the other content box as well, right? So you have now section 1 and section 2. So section 1 now containing is this particularly box, followed by this another box, which must be is a line break. All right, it must be an inline block, because now lines breaks here, similar for this. All right. So far so good. This will be a white, background, and then on the other box, right, we have is this things of how it should look like. So we have now this thin layer here. Okay. That somehow is like a box shadow here, or yeah, some sort of box shadow here. Yeah, some sort of box shadows, or border box, or border box, exactly. Some border box here. And then here we have now this second section, okay, that now the background will be this in gray, and it have now this section, and instead of the sections another one that is aligned to the center. Both of them, both content are aligned to the center, and it defined is this. So let's start with these first things, right? Shall we? So for example, here with the Huckleberry. So this is the intro chuck. Okay, let's we look at this. And there's some styles here. Add your style here. Do I need to sign in here? Okay. Really? So we have another header and the main content. Okay. And okay, so let's go to define first is the height here, right? We can say border size in border box, that's right, and also is the height of 100% here. Why not? Okay, close it. What if I do want to open up that again? Reload. And there you go. Okay. So the first element is this. So we say, hey, let's make this header. Let's make this header here to make all the available space. So header now is a box. So we define this box as it is, which is so far so good. We're saying is, hey, max width wrapper. This max width wrapper, where you say, hey, let me now make this like this. So I want to now is make the height, make the mean width, say auto to this. So in other words, if I say this, because it's taking all the available space, what happened here is that if I want to make this content to be in the center, all I can say is, hey, let's go to wrap this. All right. Just gonna make the wrap of this content and say, hey, it's gonna make is the max width of this content like 300 pixel, right? So we fix that to that like this, which is the max width wrapper. Okay, so all of this will be like that. And so this particular box will be this. Everything in this box will be this. Or in other words, I can say something like this. Hey, the intro chunk max width, the intro chunk here will be this. The width will be auto, but in this case I want to align it to the center by using margin.auto. Okay. And now this element will be aligned to the center because it's telling you to the browser, hey, take all the available space in the left and in the right. Okay. And because it's taking all of this space, well, it's now is center. But you're saying is all the available space on the inline direction. All right. So we have Huckleberry here. This one. So far so good. It actually looks like what we want to. We might want to add some padding here to the content. All right. Let's say, hey, let's take a look at the Oh, this is an entire canvas? That's fine, that's fine. That's fine, that's fine, okay. That's fine. So, well, if you have any element inside of this, alright, so for example, the title, we want is to now add the title some padding, alright. We can add the title with some padding here. And say title is padding bottom of 1 root pixel root element here. You say, hey, adding that particular style. And also I want to do is for both dimensions, so I can say is top to right do this, and left to right just 0, so adding on top of that. But we actually want is way much more padding on the top, so we can say, hey, top and down, I want this to be like 3 root element, 5 root elements, 0 on the right, 1 root element on the bottom, and 0 on the left, right? It's now adding that particularly, so it's computing that, you know. So style starting to look like quite similar, right? If you are in media, this is how it's going to look like. So starting to look like a little bit more. We can add perhaps a little bit more of that. And things starting to look quite a little bit better, right? Quite a little bit better. The color here will be now in green. So anytime we have an anchor, we want to show that as a green, all right? So we can now target this by saying, hey, if you have any padding, or for example, inside of the intro chunk, if you have inside of the intro chunk any class that is, if you have inside of the intro chunk any paragraph that has a strong tag, okay, well, I want the color to be is some green, something like that, greenish color, you know, yes, something like that. So green, yes, a green color here. Or to try to actually match that color, we can say, hey, let's going to use now the HSL, okay, where the huge represent is the color red, blue, green, let's say 270, something like that, with a saturation of 50 and illumination of 50%. All right. What about, okay, so maybe 120, something like that, 30, 40, 50, 60. This is green. The color should be something like this. You can actually add now the lightning or the saturation to say, hey, I want to more a gray scale color, right? A more grayscale color, right? In that domain. So now it makes it oh my god, the intuition is way much more accurate here. All right. So passion with logistic, of course, this is not the right color. I can say 20%, for example, right? And you can see that actually quite match that, quite match that. So this is mind bending stuff because actually color is way much more intuitive to go with, especially HSL. Definitely, definitely. So we solve a particular problem with color. And right, and I do want is to now add some padding too. So I can say is not only add the padding to that, or do something like this. So let's going to add now padding to the, say, padding bottom. All right. It's going to add now padding bottom here, and on the wrapper I do want is to now is add the padding here, right? So this particular box that is now aligned to the center, it say, hey, on the left and right I don't want to add any padding, but on the top and down I do. I mean, is this, I can say 6 element, for example, and 0. So it's gonna add this padding to top and down. Might be too much. Might be too much, right? We can say is yeah, might be too much. Absolutely might be too much. You say, hey, what about adding a little bit of padding on the top 3, right? Nothing on the right, but at least is, what I'm gonna do is this, but at least on the bottom and nothing on the inline direction. Okay. So things like too much for that. But for some reason, it's like adding that to, okay, because I do find that they are using is that, okay, yeah. Okay, if we are using is that as it is, okay. Now when we define is the background color, whether it's white or gray, all right, it's gonna be on that particular box, right? So far so good, because now the next one is to define this particular now container, right, which is part of the car. Max with the wrapper here. So with this car I can define is this, hey, this will be the car, okay, and I want to define is perhaps a max width of 320 pixels, okay, where the background color will be now white. Might be this. No, I mean is not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Because this is inside of the car. What I can say is this. First, the main will now have is a background color of HSL. You can say 0, saturation 50%, lightness 50%. Yeah, somewhat like grayscale here. You can say 10. And you can say 10 here. Not that intense, you know. I can now is add some opacity here. I do think it is. No. Is 10%. 0.5. Yeah, like something like that. A little bit of lightning might be. No, it's less, but not that much. So something like that. Okay. And the car, well, the car in itself will be is a white. You can say background color white. Yep. So it's wrapping that particular box. So that box that contains now some padding, internal padding, as you can see, that is aligned to, you can say, hey, padding, it's like one root element, so to speaking, right? Might be. So no other business can thrive with that. Wealth comes from operations. No other business can thrive without depending on specialization in operations. And yeah, this is padding one root element here. And that's also interesting because it's supposed to be something like this in order to match that gap. All right. The content now aligns. For example, no motor aligns to the huckleberry and similar to the wealth. That's quite interesting. Okay, that's quite interesting. But this must be aligned to that. So in other words, um, mhm. So in other words, um, we can do something like this, right? As a way to match now all of this. So we don't add padding to the car, right? But we just add that padding is to this. So all the content now is aligned to that. So the content now is aligned to that. And one thing we can do is to say, hey, if we now set this to that, it'll be include that particular content here. This is something that you want? Not truly. Not truly. But the content in itself now is defined as it is. So what we can do here is, hey, let's make the height of this be the author. Or particularly the height of this, the mean height be the fit content. So I do want is to know the height fit the content here. But let's go to leave that as it is for this moment, shall we? So instead of actually now adding this padding to that, we can say, hey, let's going to add the padding is to the intro chunk. All right. Oh, to the intro chunk. To the intro chunk, which is this particular box around it, and also is into the car here, right? So now these actually are aligned to. This now is aligned to. So the content now fails in that particular line. So, but one thing remains here, right? Which is, hey, how we're doing is this. So we're adding is this chunks, especially in the content here, in the car. Which, as you can see, you might say, hey, this might not be what we want. Perhaps on the padding, which is like this, to actually align this to that, which is great. But I want to now add some margin here to top and down, and not in any other dimension. No, I don't. So by adding this margin here, Okay. So the car here, okay. So now this particular car that is wrapped into these elements that we wrap this as a section, okay. Uh, exactly, because that's what we are telling to do this. Hey, is this one. Mhm. Exactly, it's this particular box. Mm-hmm. On connecting, so this might be like 360 to actually match that on the connecting, right? Focusing on the connecting and so on and so forth. So on desktop will look like this, okay? Similar for this. And the other is for that. So let's take a look now at this particularly workshop solution. Because I do grasp is a lot of the concept here.
So we begin this workshop with an entirely unstyled HTML document, and I do recognize it can be a little bit daunting in terms of figuring out how to turn this document into something that looks like this. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be done, and where do you even start with a challenge like this? Well, I like to use a strategy that I imagine sculptors use, where, you're delivered this gigantic marble block and you're expected to turn it into a sculpture of David. I imagine the way that works is you start by lobbing off huge chunks, right? You do very coarse, very rough work, until eventually once you have things in broadly the right shape, you start doing some of the fine chisel work, like giving the sculpture eyebrows and biceps. Similarly, I want to start by getting everything in broadly the right position, and then we'll deal with things like the text styles and the colors and the little effects and all of that. Now, the first thing I notice when I look at this design is that I have this center column, and it's most obvious with this card down here. It looks like we have, well, it says 808, but there is this little overhang detail that we're going to talk about later, so really the card is 800 pixels across, and I suspect that we have the same kind of structure up here, because if we notice, the text on this page all lines up perfectly. Like there's this very clear vertical line that all the text shares. And because this is like a centered column within the page, it's not easy to do that. Like, in order for all this stuff to line up, it has to be the same size. Otherwise, all of this stuff would be somewhere else, right, if the container was a different width. And yet, clearly the lines don't go all the way to the end, right? It's not as if we had an 800 pixel wide container, because, it really doesn't look very nice when we do that. So there's a couple of interesting challenges right off the bat. By the way, I have to confess, normally with these workshops, I'm sort of playing the part of the student trying to figure out the mysteries of how to solve it, when really I'm the person who put this all together, so I know. But in this case, it's actually been 2 years since I initially created this workshop, and so I really am, sort of, figuring this out along with you, because I don't really remember what I was thinking 2 years ago when I built this workshop. I'm re-recording the video because I wasn't happy with the earlier one. And so, looking at this markup, right, I have my body tag, it has a header, and a main. We're going to focus on the header for now. And I have this div with class max width wrapper. And I'm going to follow what we learned in the module, where this is going to be an element. I'm going to give it a width of 800 pixels. That's what I determined from the Figma. And I'm going to center it by setting the left and right margin to auto. I'll set the top and bottom margin to 0 as well. When I do that, that one rule really makes a pretty big difference, and things are already looking much better. Now, in the header, I have 96 pixels of space above and 64 pixels of space below. By the way, in Figma, if you hold the Option or Alt key, it'll show you the distance between a single element and any other element as you move the cursor around. I think you have to be logged in for this to work, and so if you're just seeing a hand, that's a sign that you need to log in. And I should say, these values aren't super trustworthy. There's often a subtle difference between how Figma renders something, especially with text. You really notice it with text. But often it's close enough that it at least gets us into the right ballpark. And so I know I want to put 96 pixels of padding on top and 64 pixels of padding below. But where should I do that? I could do it on the header, or I could do it on the max width wrapper, but I don't want to do that because I have another max width wrapper below, and I want them to focus on the max width wrapping and not have a bunch of other random styles there. But actually, I'm going to put it on this div class intro chunk. I want these styles to be as close to the content that they wrap as possible. And so I'm going to grab this intro chunk selector, and I'm going to add padding top 96 pixels and padding bottom 64 pixels. The other thing, as we talked about, is that I don't want to let these lines run on like this. I want them to be constrained by a smaller container. And so, looking at the Figma, it looks like the number is 415 pixels. We want them to be 415 pixels wide. And so in this intro chunk, I'm going to add a max width of 415 pixels. Now it doesn't look quite right yet, and that's because the font styles are different. We have smaller text over here than we have over here, but that is a fine detail that I want to deal with later. For now, I think the header is in a broad enough shape that we can move on to the main content. And the first thing I notice about this main content is the different background color and the card that it sits within. So looking at Figma, I see that I have this fill of all the 6s. I prefer to work in HSL color, and so I see that it's 0 degrees, 0%, and 40%. And so, in my index.html, I'm going to find the tag that I want to use. In this case, I want to use the main tag, and I'm going to add on the main tag a background color of HSL 0 degrees, 0%, and 40%. Now that obviously doesn't look great, but I don't want to start changing my text to white because there's another important part missing, which is the white card background. So, in my HTML, I'm going to see where I should apply that, and I see that I do have a div class card, so I'm going to add a new rule for the card class that sets the background color to white. Alright, so that's good, but the padding clearly needs some work. If I go back to the Figma, I notice that I have 64 pixels of space above, and it looks like 58 pixels here, but that's, I think, because the viewport is only so big. If we look at the tablet, we see something a little bit kind of awkward. We can confirm that it's 64 pixels. It says 72 up here, but that's because it's not factoring in that 8 pixels of border. Like, if we really get in there, we can see that it's 64. It's a little bit hard to tell. But then we have this giant white gap underneath. And, it would probably be nicer if this background extended all the way down. Unfortunately, that's a really annoying problem to solve without Flexbox. We haven't learned Flexbox yet, so we're going to punt on this for now and leave it with kind of an awkward white gap below. And I'm going to use 64 pixels as my number of padding on the main tag. I only want to do it on the top and bottom, though. And actually, something we haven't talked about at all yet is tablet and mobile styles. Now, fortunately, there isn't actually that much to this in terms of we don't need media queries, but there's two things that we have to change here. One is that I want some padding. Like, I don't want the text to be right up against the edge of the viewport like that. And the other is that I don't want a horizontal scroll like this. So, if we look at the styles that we have, one of the problems is that I've used width here instead of max width. And the other problem is that I want some padding on this max width wrapper. And if we look at the Figma, it looks like we have 24 pixels of padding on the card. And for now, I'm going to assume that that is our sort of universal padding number. We might address that later, but actually I think that should work just fine. So I'll say padding, 0 pixels on the top and 24 pixels on either side. Actually, yeah, the way to check that is to see what the padding looks like over here. And indeed, I see that there is 24 pixels when we get to these smaller screen sizes. Looking at this now with smaller viewports, I think this is looking pretty darn good. The last little thing I want to do before we move on to fine details is to add some padding to this card, because it's bothering me that the text is so tightly constrained. And as we just saw, there is 24 pixels of padding on this card. So on my card, I will add padding 24 pixels, and I'll do it on all 4 sides. Like, even though clearly there's more space on the top, or maybe even less space, depending on how you count, that to me feels like a weird exception. In general, we want 24 pixels of padding. So this is looking good, but there is one thing that is so easy to miss, but so important to make something that really feels professional. We've lost our clean line over here where all the text neatly corresponds to a single line. Instead, now the text is lining up with our card, which I suppose isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's not the effect that we're going after in this case. I want all the text to line up nicely. To fix that, I'm going to have to inset the card by the same amount of its padding. And so I'm going to say the margin should be 0 on top and bottom, but negative 24 pixels left and right. By doing that, I add 24 pixels of padding horizontally, but then I push the whole card inwards by 24 pixels. And so the two values essentially cancel each other out, and we restore our clean text line. Let's go back to the header, and let's figure in some of these fine details now. One thing I notice is that headings and paragraphs have some default margin, right? That's they come with the browser. These days, I think it's pretty standardized between browsers, but theoretically, different browsers could have different styles. Normally, this is something we address with a CSS reset, but I've chosen to keep things as simple and minimal as possible here, not introduce a bunch of CSS that we haven't talked about yet. And so for now, I'm going to unset the styles that I don't need as I apply the styles that I want. And looking at the heading, this H1 that we have over here, it looks like I want the font size to be 32 pixels or equivalent, and I want the line height to be 120%. So in my styles, I'm going to add a new style for H1. It's going to have font size to rem. And I'm using rems here because I want to give the user as much control as I can. If I used the equivalent in pixels, it would mean that the user can't override this value in their browser settings. I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. For now, we're going to make it 2 rem, and I'm going to set the line height to be 1.2. I think you actually can make it 120% as well, but it's more conventional to use this unitless number with line height. I'm also going to remove all the margin. We'll figure out the margin, if necessary, shortly. For the paragraph, it looks like I want the font size to be 20 pixels and the line height to be 150%. So I'm going to add another style for paragraph with font size 1.25 rem and line height 1.5. If you're wondering how to calculate, like how do I get from 20 pixels to 1.25 rem, well, you divide the number by 16. So 20 divided by 16 is equal to 1.25. All right, with that done, that is already looking way, way better. But now I notice that there is some margin on the paragraph. So let's remove that as well. And then let's actually figure out what I want the margin to be. So it looks like I want 48 pixels between the H1 and the paragraph, and 16 pixels between paragraphs. And fortunately, the same values are used across both sets of paragraphs. Like all the same text styles are reused. So I'm going to set the margin at document. And so we begin this workshop with an entirely unstyled HTML document. And I do recognize it can be a little bit daunting in terms of figuring out how to turn this document into something that looks like this. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be done, and where do you even start with a challenge like this? Well, I like to use a strategy that I imagine sculptors use, where you're delivered this gigantic marble block and you're expected to turn it into a sculpture of David. I imagine the way that works is you start by lobbing off huge chunks, right? You do very coarse, very rough work until eventually once you have things in broadly the right shape, you start doing some of the fine chisel work, like giving the sculpture eyebrows and biceps. Similarly, I want to start by getting everything in broadly the right, and you're expected to turn it into a sculpture of David, something that looks like this. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be done, and where do you even start with a challenge like this? Well, I like to use a strategy that I imagine sculptors use, where you're delivered this gigantic marble block and you're expected to turn it into a sculpture of David. I imagine the way that works is you start by lobbing off huge chunks, right? You do very coarse, very rough work, until eventually once you have things in broadly the right shape, you start doing some of the fine chisel work, like giving the sculpture eyebrows and biceps. Similarly, I want to start by getting everything in broadly the right position, and then we'll deal with things like the text styles and the colors and the little effects and all of that. And the first thing I notice when I look at this design is that I have this center column, and it's most obvious with this card down here. It looks like we have, well, it says 808, but there is this little overhang detail that we're going to talk about later, so really the card is 800 pixels across. And I suspect that we have the same kind of structure up here, because if we notice, the text on this page all lines up perfectly. Like there's this very clear vertical line that all the text shares. And because this is like a centered column within the page, it's not easy to do that. Like, in order for all this stuff to line up, it has to be the same size. Otherwise, all of this stuff would be somewhere else, right, if the container was a different width. And yet, clearly the lines don't go all the way to the end, right? It's not as if we had an 800 pixel wide container, because, it really doesn't look very nice when we do that. So there's a couple of interesting challenges right off the bat. By the way, I have to confess, normally with these workshops, I'm sort of playing the part of the student trying to figure out the mysteries of how to solve it, when really I'm the person who put this all together, so I know. But in this case, it's actually been 2 years since I initially created this workshop, and so I really am sort of figuring this out along with you, because I don't really remember what I was thinking 2 years ago when I built this workshop. I'm re-recording the video because I wasn't happy with the earlier one. And so, looking at this markup, right, I have my body tag, it has a header and a main. We're going to focus on the header for now. And I have this div with class maxWidthWrapper. And we're going to follow what we learned in the module, where this is going to be an element. I'm going to give it a width of 800 pixels, because that's what I determined from the Figma. And I'm going to center it by setting the left and right margin to auto. I'll set the top and bottom margin to 0 as well. When I do that, that one rule really makes a pretty big difference, and things are already looking much better. Now, in the header, I have 96 pixels of space above and 64 pixels of space below. By the way, in Figma, if you hold the Option or Alt key, it'll show you the distance between a single element and any other element as you move the cursor around. I think you have to be logged in for this to work, and so if you're just seeing a hand, that's a sign that you need to log in. And I should say, these values aren't super trustworthy. There's often a subtle difference between how Figma renders something, especially with text. You really notice it with text. But often it's close enough that it at least gets us into the right ballpark. And so I know I want to put 96 pixels of padding on top and 64 pixels of padding below. But where should I do that? I could do it on the header, or I could do it on the maxWidthWrapper, but I don't want to do that because I have another maxWidthWrapper below, and I want them to focus on the maxWidth wrapping and not have a bunch of other random styles there. But actually, I'm going to put it on this div class intro chunk. I want these styles to be as close to the content that they wrap as possible. And so I'm going to grab this intro chunk selector, and I'm going to add padding top 96 pixels and padding bottom 64 pixels. The other thing, as we talked about, is that I don't want to let these lines run on like this. I want them to be constrained by a smaller container. And so, looking at the Figma, it looks like the number is 415 pixels. We want them to be 415 pixels wide. And so in this intro chunk, I'm going to add a max width of 415 pixels. Now, it doesn't look quite right yet, and that's because the font styles are different. We have smaller text over here than we have over here. But that is a fine detail that I want to deal with later. For now, I think the header is in a broad enough shape that we can move on to the main content. And the first thing I notice about this main content is the different background color and the card that sits within. So looking at Figma, I see that I have this fill of all the 6s. I prefer to work in HSL color, and so I see that it's 0 degrees, 0%, and 40%. And so, in my index.html, I'm going to find the tag that I want to use. In this case, I want to use the main tag, and I'm going to add on the main tag a background color of HSL, 0 degrees, 0%, and 40%. Now that obviously doesn't look great, but I don't want to start changing my text to white, because there's another important part missing, which is the white card background. So, in my HTML, I'm going to see where I should apply that, and I see that I do have a div class card, so I'm going to add a new rule for the card class that sets the background color to white. Alright, so that's good, but the padding clearly needs some work. If I go back to the Figma, I notice that I have 64 pixels of space above, and it looks like 58 pixels here, but that's, I think, because the viewport is only so big. If we look at the tablet, we see something a little bit kind of awkward. We can confirm that it's 64 pixels. It says 72 up here, but that's because it's not factoring in that 8 pixels of border. Like, if we really get in there, we can see that it's 64. It's a little bit hard to tell. But then we have this giant white gap underneath. And, it would probably be nicer if this background extended all the way down. Unfortunately, that's a really annoying problem to solve without Flexbox. We haven't learned Flexbox yet, so we're going to punt on this for now and leave it with kind of an awkward white gap below. And I'm going to use 64 pixels as my number of padding on the main tag. I only want to do it on the top and bottom, though. And actually, something we haven't talked about at all yet is tablet and mobile styles. Now, fortunately, there isn't actually that much to this, in terms we don't need media queries, but there's two things that we have to change here. One is that I want some padding. Like, I don't want the text to be right up against the edge of the viewport like that. And the other is that I don't want a horizontal scroll like this. So, if we look at the styles that we have, one of the problems is that I've used width here instead of max width. And the other problem is that I want some padding on this max width wrapper. And if we look at the Figma, it looks like we have 24 pixels of padding on the card. And for now, I'm going to assume that that is our sort of universal padding number. We might address that later, but actually I think that should work just fine. So I'll say padding, 0 pixels on the top and 24 pixels on either side. Actually, yeah, the way to check that is to see what the padding looks like over here. And indeed, I see that there is 24 pixels when we get to these smaller screen sizes. Looking at this now with smaller viewports, I think this is looking pretty darn good. The last little thing I want to do before we move on to fine details is...
And in my case, it doesn't look like that. And it's because I actually is now look like this. So in my case, I add the max width to 300 pixels, but it's like 820 or 800 pixels here. Right, so 800 pixels here. I do want to center that there.
So I'll say the text is so tightly constrained
And this is because this is part of the car here.
pixels on either side. Actually, yeah, the way to check that, 24 pixels be right up against the... Something we haven't talked about at all yet is tablet and mobile styles. Below, and I'm it all the way down. But then we have this viewport is only so big, base above, background color to white.
But this is because we are adding this. Exactly. So this wrapper, this Max Wix wrapper.
All right, so that's good, but the padding clearly needs some work. If I go back to the Figma, I notice that I have 64 pixels of space above, and it looks like 58 pixels here, but that's, I think, because the viewport is only so big. If we look at the tablet, we see something a little bit kind of awkward. We can confirm that it's 64 pixels. It says 72 up here, but that's because it's not factoring in that 8 pixels of border. Like, if we really get in there, we can see that it's 64 without flex views. Fortunately, there isn't actually that much because it's, so I'm going HSL, 0 degrees.
See, we add this 96 and 64 into the intro chunk.
0% and 40%.
Which is exactly what it did here. Into the intro chunk, I add this particularly padding here, you know.
Now that obviously doesn't look great, but I don't want to start changing my text to white because there's another important part missing, which is the white card background. So in my HTML, I'm going to see where I should apply that, and I see that I do have a div class card, so I'm going to add a new rule for the card class that sets the background color to white. All right, so that's good, but the padding clearly needs some work. If I go back to the Figma, I notice that I have 64 pixels of space above, and it looks like, that's good.
Exactly. All of this is just to define is the structure of the position of this element on the layer.
But the padding clearly needs some work. If I go back to the Figma, I notice that I have 64 pixels of space above, and it looks like 58 pixels here, but that's, I think, because the viewport is only so big. If we look at the tablet, we see something a little bit kind of awkward. We can confirm that it's 64 pixels. It says 72 up here, but that's because it's not factoring in that 8 pixels of border. Like, if we really get in there, we can see that it's 64. It's a little bit hard to tell. But then we have this giant white gap underneath. And, you know, it would probably be nicer if this background extended all the way down. Unfortunately, that's a really annoying problem to solve without Flexbox. We haven't learned Flexbox yet, so we're going to punt on this for now and leave it with kind of an awkward white gap below. And I'm going to use 64 pixels as my number of padding on the main tag.
Mm-hmm.
I only want to do it on the top and bottom though. And actually, something we haven't talked about at all yet is tablet and mobile styles. Now fortunately, there isn't actually that much to this in terms of we don't need media queries, but there's two things that we have to change here. One is that I want some padding. Like, I don't want the text to be right up against the edge of the viewport like that. And the other is that I don't want a horizontal scroll like this. So, if we look at the styles that we have, one of the problems is that I've used width here instead of max width. And the other problem is that I want some padding on this max width wrapper. And if we look at the Figma, it looks like we have 24 pixels of padding on the card. And for now, I'm going to assume that that is our sort of universal padding number. We might address that later, but actually I think that should work just fine. So I'll say padding, 0 pixels on the top and 24 pixels on either side. Actually, yeah, the way to check that is to see what the padding looks like over here. And indeed, I see that there is 24 pixels when we get to these smaller screen sizes. Looking at this now with smaller viewports, I think this is looking pretty darn good. The last little thing I want to do before we move on to fine details is to add now with smaller viewports, pixels on either side. Actually, yeah, the way to check that. Padding. 0 pixels on the top and 24 pixels on either side. Actually, yeah, the way to check that is to see what the padding looks like over here. And indeed, I see that there is 24 pixels when we get to these smaller screen sizes. Looking at this now with smaller viewports, I think this is looking pretty darn good. The last little thing I want to do before we move on to fine details is to add some padding to this card, because it's bothering me that the text is so tightly constrained. And as we just saw, there is 24 pixels of padding on this card. So on my card, I will add padding 24 pixels, and I'll do it on all 4 sides. Like, even though clearly there's more space on the top, or maybe even less space, depending on how you count, that to me feels like a weird exception. In general, we want 24 pixels of padding. So this is looking good, but there is one thing that is so easy to miss, but so important to make something that really feels professional. We've lost our clean line over here where all the text neatly corresponds to a single line. Instead now the text is lining up with our card, which I suppose isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's not the effect that we're going after in this case. I want all the text to line up nicely. To fix that, I'm going to have to inset the card by the same amount of its padding. And so I'm going to say the margin should be 0 on top and bottom, but negative 24 pixels left and right. By doing that, I add 24 pixels of padding horizontally, but then I push the whole card inwards by 24 pixels. And so the two values essentially cancel each other out, and we restore our clean text line. Let's go back to the header, and let's figure in some of these fine details now. One thing I notice is that headings and paragraphs have some default margin, right? They come with the browser. These days I think it's pretty standardized between browsers, but theoretically different browsers could have different styles. Normally this is something we address with a CSS reset, but I've chosen to keep things as simple and minimal as possible here, not introduce a bunch of CSS that we haven't talked about yet. And so for now, I'm going to unset the styles that I don't need as I apply the styles that I want. And looking at the heading, this H1 that...
Which is what happened here, as it is. So is quite aligned to this, it's quite aligned to the document. But we do want is to add now some padding here. So by saying he's padding to the card 24 pixels on left and right dimensions. So it's going to now add this. And then let's going to now grab this box and move this in the margin dimension by saying margin left to minus 24 pixels. So it's going to now move these elements towards, which now it is aligned to the text here. We can also add this to add padding to all of these dimensions. Alright, in the clockwise. And here we go. Okay.
that we have over here. It looks like I want the font size to be 32 pixels or equivalent, and I want the line height to be 120%. So, in my styles, I'm going to add a new style for H1. It's going to have font size to rem. And I'm using rems here because I want to give the user as much control as I can. If I used the equivalent in pixels, it would mean that the user can't override this value in their browser settings. I'll show you an example of that in a little bit. For now, we're going to make it 2 rem, and I'm going to set the line height to be 1.2. I think you actually can make it 120% as well, but it's more conventional to use this unitless number with line height. I'm also going to remove all the margin. We'll figure out the margin, if necessary, shortly. For the paragraph, it looks like I want the font size to be 20 pixels and the line height to be 150%. So I'm going to add another style for paragraph with font size 1.25 rem, and line height 1.5. If you're wondering how to calculate, like how do I get from 20 pixels to 1.25 rem, well, you divide the number by 16. So 20 divided by 16 is equal to 1.25. All right, with that done, that is already looking way, way better. But now I notice that there is some margin on the paragraph. So let's remove that as well. And then let's actually figure out what I want the margin to be. So it looks like I want 48 pixels between the H1 and the paragraph, and 16 pixels between paragraphs. And fortunately, the same values are used across both sets of paragraphs. Like all the same text styles are reused. So I'm going to set the margin bottom to be 1 rem. And for the H1, I'm going to set the margin bottom to be 3 rem. Once again, 48 divided by 16 is 3, which is how I came up with that value. I do want to apply a color to the bold text within this paragraph, because if we look at the Figma, we see that it has this nice green color. And all of the values for this should be in the README, but you can also grab them from the Figma. In this case, it's 160 degrees with 100% saturation. And
okay, it was quite close. But it was 160% degree. I'm gonna leave that because that quite actually matched the intuition. You know, it's 100% lightness, saturation, and 30% lightness. Let's say I can actually find that.
30% lightness. So I'm going to add another 100% and 30%. The last thing I think we have to do for the header is to give it a bottom border like we see over here in the Figma. Figma, by the way, is a little bit weird. You can't apply borders only to one side of an element, or at least if you can, I haven't figured it out. So instead I have these different elements that serve that purpose, but really this should be thought of as an 8 pixel wide bottom border with 60% lightness. So on the header, which I don't think I've created a style for yet, I'll set the border bottom to be 8 pixels solid and use the HSL color that I got from the Figma. Look at this now. Things are really starting to come together.
Exactly. So this is now a border.
Pixel solid and
border
use the
bottom.
HSL color that I got from the Figma.
Exactly, because here we're adding is a border.
To be 8 pixels solid and use the HSL.
In the case of the header. So in the case of the header, we add that now. In the case of the header, we add now this border bottom of 8 pixel. What is required is the border width and the color HSL, which I am not what it is because I cannot sign in, so please tell me here.
Color that I got from.
Okay, so this is the color that I got from Figma. Oh, is actually backwards. It's this and 60% of lightness. And look at that. If I apply now that, I actually have that nice little border here. Border bottom here.
From the Figma. Look at this now. Things are really starting to come together. And I think that's actually almost done for the header. There is sort of an awkward amount of space right over here. Like it looks slightly bigger than we see over here. And the reason for this can be a little bit confusing. If I look at the styles for this, I notice that the paragraph has 16 pixels of bottom margin. And I do want that space on this paragraph because I want that space to be between paragraphs. But I don't want it to be on the final paragraph. So to solve for that, I'm going to add another rule. I'm going to target the paragraphs that are also last children, and I'm going to set margin bottom to 0. Essentially overrule the bottom margin when it's the final paragraph, so that that paragraph doesn't stack with any padding that's on the container. All right, so the main and bottom to 0. I'm going to target the paragraphs that are also last children, and I'm going to set margin bottom to 0. Essentially overrule the bottom margin when it's the final paragraph, so that that paragraph doesn't stack with any padding that's on the container. All right, so the main content now, and the biggest thing missing from this is the fancy heading. Like we have this yellow banner that peeks out the side. Looking at this now, I have the text, which is 24 pixels with 120% line height, and it has 32 pixels of side padding and 16 pixels of top and bottom padding. I realize it says 15 here. That's just one of these quirks with Figma's fonts not being the exact same as the web browser's font, so we're going to treat it as 16 on both sides. If I look in my HTML, I see that I have this H2 with class indented heading, so all of my styles are going to go on that. I'm going to set the font size to 1.5 rem, the line height to 1.2. I'm going to reset the margin for now. We'll see if we have to do anything with that. And for the padding, I'm going to say 16 pixels and 32 pixels. We really should give it that background color because it really feels like it needs it. And so I'm going to look that color value up. It is 45, 150, and it also has this bottom border style, which is 45 degrees, 100%, and 40%.
Is it because that is now?
So I'm going to say the background has that color, 45 degrees, 100%, 50%, and the border bottom is another 8 pixels wide, solid, and has almost the same color, 45 degrees, 100%, and 40%. This is looking all right. But two big problems. One is that it's not being pushed out of the card like it is in the design, and the other is that it goes on too long. Like it's doing the standard block level element thing of expanding to fill all of the horizontal space. To fix that second problem, I'm going to give it a width of fit content, and that'll make sure that it shrinks down to the size of the content. And for the first problem, I'm going to give it a negative margin left. So like, for example, if I make it minus 24 pixels, we see that then it pushes it in by the exact amount of the padding, essentially canceling the padding. But in this case, I want to go even a little bit further. So let's make it minus 32 pixels. I really do love this effect, right? Just cosmetically of things sort of hanging off the edge like this. I wonder why you don't see this more often, because it really is a very neat little effect. Now, in terms of top and bottom spacing, if I look at the design, we actually have a very tiny amount of space on top. It looks like it's only 8 pixels on top, and in terms of the bottom spacing, we have 16 pixels. Now, the tricky thing here is that if we look at it in browser, there's already much more than 8 pixels. There's the standard 24 pixels that we have on the card. And so I could go to my card, and I could change the padding so that the padding top is 8 pixels. That technically works, but it doesn't feel quite right to me. Like, we can imagine that maybe this card is a reusable class that I want to use in lots of different places, and in the other places I might want the standard 24 pixels of padding all around. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go to my indented heading, and I'm going to set margin top minus 16 pixels. And the way I calculate that is that there's 24 pixels of padding. I want there to be 8 left over at the end, so I have to subtract something, right? Like 24 minus what is equal to 8, and the answer is 16. Now, in terms of the bottom margin, I saw that I wanted 16 pixels, but actually I'm going to make it 1 rem instead. And when I look at this, it looks right. It's looking pretty darn good, actually. But you might very well be wondering, why would I use pixels for the top margin and rems for the bottom? Well, it all comes down to readability, right? The difference between pixels and rems is that if the user goes into their browser settings, into the Appearance tab, and if they change their font size, any pixel value will stay the same. So we still have 8 pixels of space over here, we still have 32 pixels of space over here. But anytime I use rems, like these 16 pixels that I had over here, that value is going to expand with the user's font size. And the bottom space is functional in this case. Like I have a heading and a paragraph below, and I think I do want that space to expand with the larger font size, just like I want the space between paragraphs to expand, so that it's clear that they're separate paragraphs. That's always the mental model I recommend using, is should this value, this spacing thing, this padding thing, whatever it is, should it expand with the user's font size or not? If so, you should use something like rems or ems, and if not, you should use pixels. So looking at this now, we're definitely almost there. I think the last little detail that we need is that the card has a bottom border. So I'll quickly add that now. On the card class, I'll give it a border bottom of 8 pixels solid, and I'll reuse the same color we used before with a lightness value of 60%. And look at that. It is kind of remarkable to think, we started from this purely unstyled HTML document, and in the course of about 20 minutes, we've added all the styles for this landing page. We can also take a look at how it works with smaller viewport sizes, and I think things are scaling pretty darn well. And I think it's worth taking a moment to celebrate the progress that you've made so far. Whether or not you were able to come up with a solution on your own, we've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah,
and it's
absolutely.
kind of remarkable how much we can do with only flow layout, right? We haven't talked about position layout or flexbox or grid. And so even though our journey is just beginning, right? This is the end of the first module with a workshop. There's so much more to go, and I'm so excited that you're here on this journey. I hope you're feeling excited too, and seeing now just how much we can do with the tools that we've had, and how much more we'll be able to do with the tools.
The rectangle tool I'm using is to measure in this video is the default screen tool built in macOS. You can check the power toys, green shot, or K ruler. Power toys. Screen rule utility. Interesting. For folks not on macOS, you can check power tools. The default screenshot, default built-in. Oh, exactly. The default screenshot. Okay, exactly. I've created a treasury trove entry about measuring size and distance on the screen. Treasury trove. An easy mistake to make. All the tools we are about to discuss take measurements based on the current rendering distance and size on the screen. If we have zoom in so that the page is at 125% zoom, our measurements will be 20% larger than it should be. To ensure an accuracy measurement, be sure to reset the zoom to the default level. In most browsers, this can be done by this. Okay. To the default level. I don't like the default level. Like this. Windows and Linux alternative. So for example, like this, a pixel snap to. A crosshair that automatically measures the distance between elements on the screen. It works in all applications. It uses a contrast-based algorithm with configurable tolerance to figuring out which edge you're likely to care about. In my experience, it works super well, even with shadow and subtle gradients such as this. You can even draw a box around another object and measuring its size. Get pixel snap. Pixel snaps too. Oh, to get the measurement of that. Quite silly, bro. But yet powerful. Quite silly, but yet powerful, bro. Mm-hmm. Quite silly but yet powerful, bro. Increase coiler, a koi pen. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's interesting. Treasure trove. Component library, cubic bezier, motion, design inspiration, illustration, measure pixels, generative art, icon packs, stock photography and clippy. hmm That is mind bending. That is mind bending. hmm That is definitely mind bending. hmm hmm And then the rendering logic too, with relative imposition. It is the OG layout, original gangster layout algorithm of the web, but it's not alone. hmm Relative positioning is another one. We can opt into position layout using position property. The other is the absolute positioning containing block, static context. Static context. Fixed position, overflow, and sticky position. And the hidden content. hmm hmm What about the other one? And the other is the motor architecture here. Responsive and behavioral CSS. Typography and images. CSS and grid. The animations and little bit detail. But it is all about to understand this. Okay. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.